Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for breaking your lunch hour. I seem to be sort of scheduled on various graveyard shifts to give lectures. The worst one was on last Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon when I was talking to the World Conference of Science Journalists. And actually, bless them, a few did turn up, you know, and some of them, indeed, some of them were sober, so it's all really quite exciting. I'm going to take you through a number of issues today, but I'm wanting to sort of start with really what the job is about, and then I'm going to go through what is really in my in-tray and what I've been doing in the last year since I spoke to this to a similar audience, where I actually had rather less to say on account I'd only been in the job about 6 months and was still essentially trying to work out what it meant to do the job, how on earth had I been stupid enough to agree to do it, and other sort of issues like that. Okay, so seeing if I can do this. That's it. Okay, well, this is the job, and it's fundamentally absurd. My job is I report to the Prime Minister and Cabinet, but look at the second bullet point. I'm responsible for the quality of all engineering scientific advice across the whole of government. This is fundamentally silly. You know, nobody can do this without a fair bit of help. And the way in which I've actually been able to do it is to lead a network of departmental chief advisors and also working into other networks, but I'll come on to a bit. I'm also head of the science and engineering profession in the civil service, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that role later on. And I'm supported by the Government Office for Science. About 2 or 3 of you of them are actually dotted around in order to ask me relatively modest and easily answered questions. You know, you have to sort of operate in a corporate environment in this way. This is the reporting lines, and they are strange. They are rather unique in the sense that I report only to the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and my line manager is Sir Gus O'Donnell. And effectively, but I have the opportunity in the job of linking in across clearly to ministers. There's chief scientific advisors, and I'll talk a little bit in more detail about those later. Clearly working in for other government departments. NGOs and industry are one set of stakeholders I work with. My landlord now is BIS, so Lord Mandelson is my new landlord. Prior to that it was John Denham, but albeit we're lodged within what was DIAS and is now BIS, we are part of it but not really part of it. So, and within that I have a science and government team. I have a private office of 6 or 7 people, and then we have the Foresight group, which is a substantial group of which Sandy Thomas is the director, and that, as you probably know, involves both a horizon scanning centre, but also looks at substantial studies into the future, and some of those I'm going to allude to a little later on. I talked about chief scientific advisors, and when I came into the job, my predecessor, David King, had pushed to have chief scientific advisors in all departments with some limited success. And this is the current situation, is that I have chief scientific advisors. Actually, and you'll see in this grey in the middle of the slide above the central arrow, that we're actually recruiting for chief scientific advisors for the Foreign Office, for DEC, for CLG, and actually, unusually, and this is unique, and I was interviewing candidates today for MI5. And basically, the situation is that all major departments of state now have a chief scientific advisor or are in the process of recruiting them. The exception is the Treasury. I tend to say in sort of slightly ironic tones in the different audience to this, I make no further comment on that given the financial crisis, but the underlying empirical underpinning of economic models seems to me to be an issue that one might reasonably pose if you were chief scientific advisor to the Treasury, let alone how you actually fund science and technology. I'm referring to chief scientists, but in fact, they aren't just chief scientists, they're not just mainstream scientists in the sense of being biologists, physicists, or chemists. We have a lot of engineers, and we have a lot of social scientists, and we really make no distinction. That group is really what helps me deal with the plethora of issues that are out there. I have a core group, and we meet pretty much every 6 weeks, and that core group also meets with the chief execs of the research councils about every 12 weeks. So that means that all the senior people involved in funding science in government meet about every 3 months. And that's been enormously helpful. And clearly there are other links to the major networks, the engineering institutions, primarily the Royal Academy of Engineering, but engineering has a plethora of institutions which we link with, and obviously in science, the Royal Society and universities around. As I say, it's quite a strange job and fundamentally rather difficult, but this is the network which enables me to do it. Let's now look at my in-tray. It's quite a lot, and this is by no means full. Some things have moved in and out of this in-tray. But I'm going to take you through this in-tray this afternoon and point to some of the work that we've been doing, how that work is done, and then and indicate some of it ongoing, some of it relatively successful, some unsuccessful. But looking at these are the major issues that are facing the world, and I'm going to refer to a number of them this afternoon and what we've actually been doing to address those. The first ones I'm going to look at are this top set. There are major drivers which I'm going to come on to, but when I first came into the job, one of the first things that was happening was we were seeing an unprecedented rise in the price of food, driven by a whole number of other factors. But what I'm going to talk about in this next section is essentially the way in which these issues of urbanisation, population, food security, climate change, energy and water all link together. Now, as I say, this was the very first thing, and my very first speech as Chief Scientific Advisor was to a slightly larger audience than this, namely 2,000 members of the National Farmers Union, who were not entirely favourable to government. So I confess a little bit nervous to that. But the issue was really stark at the time, and I raised the issue that food security was a real issue. And it really is. And the things that are driving food security, and they're driving other factors as well, are population growth, running at about 6 million a month at the moment, but also two other factors. One is urbanisation, which is important, and I'll talk to that in the context of water a bit later on, but also the fact that the world is getting wealthier. To give you an idea about the way the world is getting wealthier, this is primarily the result of urbanisation, globalisation in China and India. China primarily, India substantially, but to a lesser extent than China. And what that has meant is that people are getting wealthier. Give you a figure for that, is in 2005 in the developing world there were 350 million households with an income greater than 8,000 sterling. The projection to 2030 is that will rise to 2.1 billion. So if you like, it's the rise of the middle class in the developing world will increase the purchasing power of those households by a factor of 7. So 2.1 billion people by 2030 are projected to do that. And of course we've got financial downturns and so on that might slow this modestly, but one of the things that you can observe is that the developing economies are not slowing down in anything like the way that they are. This was the sort of food crisis that when I arrived, I managed to turn this off now, sorry about that. How do I turn it on? No, that way. The food prices, when I walked in the door, when I came in the door in January 2008, and you see that the prices of rice and wheat and maize had all been rising enormously. And this was unprecedented, major issues, riots on the streets in a whole number of developing countries, and big issues to do with how, in fact, the international community could feed essentially the bottom billion people who are fundamentally malnourished and only supported by food aid from the developed and the lesser developed world. There was significant movement in the international community. At the G8, it agreed to pledge in the summer of 2008 very substantial sums of money in order that they could go on the world market to purchase it. But was this a one-off? Because food prices have been declining since probably 20 or 30 years, and the last year was the first time that it actually had this blip with enormous repercussions on individuals. Probably the estimation is that another 400 million people went into poverty, a poverty level of genuine malnutrition because of that food spike. The problem is that it's actually not gone away. The economists will say, don't worry about it, the supply side will meet it. And to an extent, you can see the decline in prices that occurred post the spike has actually gone down. There's some indication that rice is coming up and that wheat and maize are flattening out. They're not continuing to decline. And in fact, they're flattening out they're at levels that are historically as high as they've been. And the reason for this, and the reason why it's not going to go away, and the reason why we're going to have constant issues of food supply, is that in fact the reserves are enormously low. This is the plot of the grain stocks in the world, which is plotted as a proportion of consumption. So, so this is an indication of how much we have reserves. And you can see from the graph that 2008, those reserves were at an unprecedented low, something of the order of 15%. So if you're talking about 15%, what's that actually mean? Well, if you have 365 days in the year, 0.15 times 365, I'm sure late in the afternoon like this you won't be able to do that arithmetic, but it's a little short of about 60 days. So we have 60 days food reserves, and that is well below half what has been the case. And it's the lowest level since the early 1970s when there was the main oil price spike generated by the OPEC cartel. That is unprecedented, and of course with these low reserves, what it means is that you have big problems of the way in which, as speculation comes into the market, or you get contingent events like droughts or floods, which actually affect the supply, that is going to mean that it goes up again. And one of the things that I pushed very hard and started and referred to my Foresight team, that they started, and this was largely at the request of the Prime Minister, to do a study on the future of food and farming. And they're looking out 50 years and asking the questions, what is the food and farming system going to be like in 50 years' time? That's ongoing, but also at the G8 summit this last week, there's been a recognition by the G8 community and the G8+5 community that there is a real need to address food. And that headline from the Financial Times and from the 6th of July indicates a real focus away from essentially giving food from large reserves held in the USA and Europe to the world's poor, but to actually focus that food aid in a substantial amount on improving farming. And the Foresight Study, which is shown also on this slide, is the idea to look out to 2050 and ask about what it's going to look like. That's food, and in a sense, the world community has recognized it. But there are other issues, and there is a set of interconnected issues which I've been giving speeches about for quite some while. I've talked about the major drivers: increasing population, increasing levels of urbanisation, and the alleviation of poverty. But of course I haven't mentioned climate change. But the real worry is that these drivers are coming together at approximately the same time scale. And what I've called is this perfect storm of global events. By 2030, there will be a need to produce something of the order of 50% more energy, 50% more food, and of the order of 30% more available fresh water. And at the same time, there's going to be a need to mitigate and adapt to climate change, because the climate change we're going to be seeing in 2030 is predetermined, because of the lags in the system, by what's in the atmosphere at the moment. Copenhagen will make a difference, but it will make a difference from, give or take, 2035 onwards. It won't make a difference to our climate change that is going to happen between now and 2030. So that's determined. And this perfect storm is really the thing that worries me, because there is a danger because of the way that the media and indeed the political process focus is that now, is to look at one but not all of these, and they're all fundamentally interconnected. You can't address the issue of climate change without the issue of energy security, and indeed you can't address it in the without ignoring the fact that individuals and this growing population in the world need food and water. And it's getting worse. And so I'll show you a couple of slides, which is why there is such concern about climate change. There was a report, prior to the Copenhagen meeting, there was a scientific summit organized in Copenhagen in March. And there are two things that I point out here. The left-hand graph shows the level of CO2, which is moving up inexorably. This is the CO2 to 2009. There's not a great deal of slowdown showing there. Indeed, that exponential curve is chugging up there quite nicely. And climate change is with us. And the right-hand curve shows the change in the mass of the ice sheet in Greenland, which is going down at an increasing rate. And these are gigatons of ice. This is sort of serious amounts. So those are two, and there's many more examples of the fact that the assessments that were done by the climate change committees, the International Program on Climate Change, was published in 2007, but that worked on data up to 2004, and things have got very seriously worse yet. Now, the global consequences of climate change are quite frightening. One can, they're all shown here. Some of them, a selection of them are done here, again highlighted in March 2009 by the panels of scientists involved. And it's a busy slide, and I've got relatively modest time to talk to you this afternoon, so I won't take you through in any great detail. But I want to focus again on things getting worse. And one area which really concerns me is the Arctic. Now, this slide shows the assessment by the IPCC. So the blue dotted line coming down the middle of the pale blue shading is essentially the average of a whole series of projections that were made by IPCC of the extent of Arctic sea ice that would occur. The shading shows the uncertainty around those expectations. And this was done, as I said, was the 2007 report. The red line is the observations. And as you can see, the observations are running well below, and therefore worse in terms of climate change effects, than the most pessimistic of the assessments made in 2007. And as you can see in the box, the prediction is that was made at a meeting at the Royal Society about 2 months ago by two American scientists from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that the Arctic Ocean is likely to be ice-free by 2030. Now, in the way of the world, scientists always disagree about detail, and there was a sort of bitter debate at this, but the debate focused on whether, in fact, the Arctic would be ice-free by 2030 or by 2036. In terms of government work, I think that's probably near enough, really. It's a thing to worry about, and we probably should be worrying about it. But there's a lot of implications. They're not implications just in terms of climate, but there's political implications. If the Arctic is going to effectively be ice-free, it means it's going to be available for exploitation of what is known to be very substantial reserves of hydrocarbons, but also of precious metals. You're talking about significant anthropomorphic change in this area, and because, and you recall the Greenland side, because this area of the world is getting warmer, there's a real danger of nasty feedbacks in which the tundra starts to become less frozen, and that you get a release of methane, which happens when essentially frozen vegetation breaks down. So these are really worrying current issues in the science. But one that we know almost nothing about, but has been highlighted by a recent work by the Royal Society, is ocean acidification. Now, this graph is again is counterintuitive. The bottom scale is millions of years, and 0 is the present time. So what that's showing, and it shows the the acidification of the ocean, or the level of acid in the ocean in 2000, which is about as acid it has been for something like 25 million years. The vertical line is not some mad model. in which people have been dealing with and projecting. This is simple physics, because it's the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere interacts with seawater and makes the sea acid. It's a good thing in the sense that it's a major reservoir of CO2, and if we didn't have it, we would have vastly more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but it means the ocean is becoming more acidic. And the projections, therefore, certainly out to about 2050, are going to happen, whatever happens in Copenhagen. Now, that implies that we're looking, and I haven't extended the graph back on the left-hand side, but it implies that the oceans are going to be as acidic as they've been for about 250 million years. And when they were that acidic, which was due to major volcanic activity on the Earth, there was something of the order of 95% of the fossil record disappeared in that period. And we have absolutely no idea whatsoever about what this ocean acidification is going to do, whether it's going to have major physical interactions with the atmosphere, whether it's going to, we know for certain that it's going to have major disruptions for ecosystems. The ones that are most vulnerable are coral reefs, and this isn't just about snorkeling. This is about 1 billion people depend on coral reefs for their main protein source, and you've got an issue that coral reefs have pretty much had it with ocean acidification. What it implies for the climate change agenda is that you need to be not shooting for 450 parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is the current G8 target, but to reverse ocean acidification, you've got to be down by around about 330, and that reversal will take of the order of 100 years, even if you achieve it. So, climate change is both worrying, it's happening, it's here. Copenhagen will make a difference, and if it doesn't, it will get worse and worse and worse. But certainly the next 20 years are largely predetermined by what's already happened, and that's a problem. So I've talked on climate change, I've talked on water, and clearly in the context of climate change, and clean energy is going to be absolutely essential, and we need to produce more clear energy. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the thing I want to focus on next is water. This is the really scary thing on a short time scale. Total water demands are predicted to increase by about 30% by 2030. And the left-hand graph shows the water scarcity occurring in 2025. The orange shading indicates significant water stress, over 40% of available water being taken out per annum. The yellow is between 20 and 40, and the blues are okay. Turning to the right, you can see water stress occurring in very large portions of the world. And water, no, it's not just what we drink, but what we use to grow crops. 70% of global water is used by agriculture, mainly subsistence agriculture. And to focus your mind a little bit about it, and I'll talk about the man later on, but Stephen Chu, who is Obama's Secretary of Energy, appointed to this executive position, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, spoke about a month after he took office and said that on current projections of global water use and on climate change, California, one of the major suppliers of fruit and veg, is unlikely to be able to provide agriculture by 2030. And that's Stephen Chu. That's not Greenpeace. Nobel Prize winner, budget of the Department of Energy, 25 billion. This is quite a serious player, and this is really shocking. And so water is important, and we have potential of water because we have real issues of political issues with water because it knows no boundaries. Clearly rivers cross national boundaries, but also major aquifers. And this slide shows both, it's quite busy. It shows major aquifers which are overexploited, major aquifers which are currently being overexploited but are not totally overexploited, but also the way in which where those aquifers lie and the importance that they lie across international boundaries. Do we have to care? Well, of course we have to care, because even if we're just caring in a selfish way, there's real potential for conflict over water, conflict over food, conflict over climate change are going to be out there as well. And this gives you an indication of the sort of things. On the left-hand side, it's problems in an area of Ethiopia where actually people are shooting at each other with Kalashnikovs over water rights, and that's concerning, worrying, and a thing that needs to be addressed. But taking it into to the right-hand side, where you've got two nuclear states arguing massively over the security of water supplies, and it's not just India and Pakistan, but it's India and Bangladesh as well. You are going to see over the next 10 years or so very, very serious conflicts over water. And we don't have any form of international legal framework for dividing up water. It's just not there. It's a big, big issue. The other consequence of this, and again I refer to our Foresight Study, is these conflicts and this perfect storm scenario is going to mean a major increase in international migration. People will not be able to live in places if they are being hit by tidal surges, if there's insufficient water, if there's insufficient food, and there will be international migration. And we have a Foresight Study that is sponsored by the Home Office on International Migration, which is started about a month or so ago, and going to be reporting in 2010, on the issue of how that international migration is going to be driven by these issues, and of course they will be exacerbated by conflict. And that conflict is unlikely to remain solely within the areas where it's happening. We have an enormous diaspora in the UK, and if you have serious battles between India and Pakistan or India and Bangladesh, it is highly unlikely that the diaspora community is going to sort of ignore it and say, oh, that's just in India and Pakistan. I think we will see real problems in UK cities, so it's selfishness as we do it. So can science and engineering provide some of these solutions to these problems? Well, part of it we have to recognize is a mix of science, engineering, and how that affects policy. We've had some good results in the UK. The Climate Change Committee made a number of recommendations based largely on the IPCC, but also on the worsening climate scenarios we've seen. And the decision the recommendation from the Climate Change Committee was that the UK should reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050, which was immediately accepted by government and put into place. We also took on that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 34% by 2020. If a global deal is reached in Copenhagen, the commitment is to reduce it further. And as you'll have seen from the newspapers and the media today, the G8 summit essentially has meant that the G8+5 summit has agreed that in fact the target for emissions reductions will be at least 80% by 2050 with a 2-degree centigrade target. But that's just them. And as we all know, it is not going to be possible to reach greenhouse gas emissions targets like this without an enormous amount of work. To give you an idea, in the UK, to meet those targets, we've got to have electricity being produced effectively carbon-free by 2030, and something of the order of 50% of a cut in our transport emissions to have any hope whatsoever of meeting that 2050 target. So it's enormously challenging, and it's a science and engineering challenge to do with it. The political challenge out there in Copenhagen, and this is the document produced by the UK on the road to Copenhagen, is what we have to achieve. We need to get every country involved. It is not feasible, whatever the developed world do, that by cutting emissions, that without some degree of response by China, India, Brazil, that you will actually achieve that. Now, this is an enormously difficult political issue. It's an issue of equity. The position taken by many in the developing world is that the developed world has benefited from polluting the world's atmosphere as they have actually developed and using essentially fossil fuels to do so, and that there needs to be some reinstatement. But we're all in the position to get there, and it's going to be a very difficult situation to move this forward. Some hope, but we have to have hope. The failure to do it means it's going to get worse. So the science and engineering, well, there are some interesting things we could do. Taking in energy, on the left is something that is actually a genuine zero energy building. It's in Guangzhou in China. in the sort of irony that comes with these things, this is the tobacco building, so that they have a sort of zero carbon emitting building, which actually is the main headquarters of the Chinese tobacco company, which is, if you actually do the simple statistics on the epidemiology, is probably killing rather a lot of Chinese. I won't quantify it. The second one is that where are we in terms of solutions to the renewables? Carbon Trust came out with a report this week in which they said that they thought, as far as the UK was concerned, we have two hopes to meet our renewables targets, and that will need serious government investment in this. The one is in using wave energy, and the second that they highlighted as important was offshore wind. Now, one of the things that the UK does have in spades is a windy, unpleasant, and wave-ridden climate. Solar energy is not really a solution for Scotland, let alone Northern England. Arguably, if we let climate change go, it might be a solution, partial solution for the south of England at some stage, but not for a long while. So the wave energy, this is a particular method of dealing with wave energy. The interactions of offshore wind and waves for the UK is that there's a synergy between them. Essentially, they don't interfere with each other. You can site them in the same place, and then you can use the same infrastructure to actually move electricity around. And of course, the other aspect is nuclear. The illustration is for nuclear fusion, a long way in the future, but a big investments in looking at nuclear fusion, which is essentially pollution-free, no real problems of raw materials, no problems of proliferation, because the byproduct of fusion is not going to be anything that could be used for terrorist attacks or putting into using to construct nuclear weapons. But this is an illustration of some work that's been done at the Culham Laboratory in the Joint European Torus. They actually have achieved fusion with hydrogen ions and generated more energy out than they've put in. The sort of temperatures that these involved are beyond anything that I can comprehend. They're 150 million degrees. You know, I sort of did ask a naive question, because I'm not on top of all science, about how you measure 150 million degrees, and somebody said, oh, it was sort of Einstein's equations, and I said, oh yeah, sure. One of the important things of being government chief scientist is you're never phased. You always know, and you nod sagely, appropriately when we do it. So other science and engineering solutions are in water. This is rather more readily understandable. Clearly, we have an issue in water. We need to be thinking about recycling water. We need to be thinking about how it's used in agriculture in a better way. Manufacturing and energy supply are going to be important in the water context. And the bullet points at the bottom indicate the sort of things that science and technology can do it. The Zhejiang province in China is in the news at the moment because of the ethnic tensions and the ethnic fighting that's been occurring there. But actually in that region, because of the melting of the glaciers and essentially tropical glaciers, they're building 60 underground reservoirs to actually catch the runoff from these glaciers. That's a big investment, a lot of people. China has 23% of the world's population and 11% of the world's water. India has similar statistics apply to India. These major economies are really going to have to think about how water technology is developed to do it. I started with food, and I'm going to come with a couple more slides, then I'm going to move on to out of this perfect storm arena. My first trip abroad was to Brazil, and where I came to the civil service from Imperial College, so I was delighted to meet somebody who was running one of the main research stations outside Brazil, and he was from Imperial College, and he set me up and said, we have a crop here, a crop rotation between soybean and cotton. What do you think the downtime of that is? I said, I don't know, a couple of weeks, that would be the typical time you would get for crops in the UK. And he said, no, it's half an hour. And if you look at the right-hand slide, that's how they do it. That's essentially soybean harvesters followed 100 meters behind by cotton planters. And to add insult to injury, they actually have 2 crops a year in Brazil. And so you are looking at something that in which the land is not actually under cultivation for an hour a year. This is arguably an unacceptable face of agriculture, but it may be part of the solution that we may need if we're going to feed an extra couple of billion people with no more land, no more water, and a real shortage of pesticides and fertilizers, which were what drove the Green Revolution. The left-hand side is alternatives to this. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, there are large numbers of small farmers whose current yields are about a ton a hectare. To give you an idea, the UK, we have about 8 tons a hectare. And it's been calculated by the development agronomists that if you put in infrastructure and had access to markets there, with very simple technology, you could probably increase that by 300%. So these are alternatives. And I think we're going to have, there's no easy solution, you're going to have to do it both. One area, and I'll flip over this because I'm running out of time, is biotechnology, including GM crops. Biotechnology is a way of dealing with a couple of problems. The first one is losses due to pests and disease. 30-odd% of pests and disease, crops are lost before they're harvested in the developing world, and also significant in the developed. Post-harvest, the losses are of the order of 25%. So give or take, 40% of all the major crops are actually lost before they actually are used. And in that sort of irony that you have in the world, in the developed economies, we're wasting something about 30% of the food that actually is retail. So there are some real wins here. And genomics, the understanding the fundamental genetic composition of plants, has the potential to address this, to get plants to grow in harsh environments and to get plants that are actually resistant to pests and disease. So that's the perfect storm thing, so I'll move on to the next cheerful topic. So talking about infectious diseases. There's a lot of them about. Let's look at where they are. It's in both infectious diseases of animals and humans. One of the things that we were extremely worried about, and still are, is in fact the avian influenza and its potential to jump the human barrier and start infecting humans. Avian influenza, when it does jump, kills 60% of the people who get it. To give you an idea, the main epidemic, the worst pandemic that occurred in the 20th century was in 1918, and that killed about 2.5%. This is killing 60% of the people who get it. Fortunately, it's not jumping the barrier, and the transmission is from essentially birds to humans, but there's no human-to-human transmission. BSC you're familiar with. Blue tongue was a major success in the UK that we managed to predict it was going to happen and get a vaccine in time. Bovine TB, a regular controversy whether in fact we should actually kill the whole badger population or seriously reduce badger populations to reduce bovine TB in cattle. We have a rabies policy. Scrapie is a worry that whether in fact you may get a transmission to humans. Unlikely, given it's been around for several hundred years. And on the human diseases, there are of course AIDS. We have big worries about the change in malaria patterns, particularly as the world is warming up. And we have issues of MRSA in our hospitals, immunity to most of the main drugs to deal with them. And we've got influenza. And I won't come on to swine flu quite yet, but in infectious diseases, talking about the Foresight team again, they had a project reporting well before my time, looking at the detection and identification of infectious diseases. This has had a real effect. There was a G8 declaration in support of it. Funding has been found for an African centre for surveillance of infectious diseases, both of animals and humans. And the UK government has put 55 million into that. So a very good, effective way in which you can see how the Foresight team have managed to change policy. One of the things about our Foresight team, which I will emphasize, is really that it's not producing a report that goes on a shelf and is read or not read. It actually has, we have follow-up teams who, once a Foresight report comes out, engage with government and stakeholders to try and actually make a difference. And this was an example of a very significant improvement. But everybody's talking about swine flu, so I pretty much got to. In fact, I've been doing very little else in the last couple of months other than dealing with swine flu. Just to put this in context, pandemics have occurred always in human history, flu pandemics in particular, and the big one, the real worrying one, was the 1918 called Spanish influenza. That killed very, very significant numbers of people in the world. Whole villages and indeed whole regions of parts of southern Europe were wiped out. It's the worst pandemic we've had. There have been others since. Notice those of you who are not sort of biologists or molecular biologists or virologists know the H1N1. These are different types of strains of flu. H1N1 is a type that caused the major epidemic. The seasonal flus that we observe and some of the bad epidemics and pandemics we've had of seasonal flu, there were 3 in the last century, including the Spanish one. These kill significant numbers of people, in the few millions. The one in 1918 killed some tens of millions. They're unusual in the sense that they don't tend to target the typical influenza targets of the young and the elderly. They tend to attack primarily the young and the fit, and that's an unusual characteristic of pandemics. Nobody knows why, in the sense there's no way of understanding that is what drives the underlying causal mechanisms here, but it's an observation. So imagine our delight was when we started to notice about in early April that there were large numbers of people being reported dying of flu in Mexico. And then once the virologists looked at it, they found that it contained elements of both avian influenza, swine flu, and the H1N1 human. And it's a complicated viral conglomerate and is operating now. It's a difficult one because it actually is relatively mild. People die of it, but the death rate is relatively small, something like 0.1% of cases. So we have about 7,000 cases in the UK. I think we have 5 or 6 deaths now. So it's about 1 in 1,000 who get it die of it. So it's relatively mild. But the concern we actually have is that it's operating currently in the Northern Hemisphere in our summer when flu doesn't work. 2 reasons: the transmission is lowered, is that schools are on holiday, and second, that the actual climatic conditions of relatively warm, not particularly humid and dry and sunny seem, and there's no real explanation of why this is the case, not to be conducive to the transmission of flu. But it's operating substantially in the Southern Hemisphere, in the slums of Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, in Buenos Aires. This is operating in the southern winter, and it's there. Flu viruses mutate. There have already been examples of this particular virus showing resistance to the main antiviral. And the worry that we have is that there will be a mutation to make this more virulent, and that mutation will then come back into the UK, or come back into the Northern Hemisphere. To give you a sort of lighter thing on that, I was approached by the National Farmers Union to say, why can't we call it Mexican flu rather than swine flu? Do you not realize we have a pig industry? Not much I could do about it. It kind of hit the headlines as being swine flu, but and the Mexican Tourist Authority weren't too keen on agreeing to the change of venue. But part of my job is to be involved in this, and I'm involved in it by providing independent scientific advice. Clearly, the Health Protection Agency and the Department of Health have the main responsibility for doing that. But the government, in terms of emergencies, and the emergencies can be everything from a terrorist attack through to something like flu or other issue or a major industrial incident, the decision has been taken, it was taken quite early on, that we needed independent scientific advice so that we were actually validating and assessing the work that was being done by government agencies. So I chair this group called the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, containing many scientists from the HPA and the Department of Health, but also independent scientists. And we provide advice to the CCC, or the COBRA committee, as that develops. So we've been providing advice, and that advice sometimes is in agreement with what DH and Department of Health and HPA have been proposing. Sometimes it complements it, sometimes it actually there's some degree of disagreement. But that is the thing that has been taking up quite a lot of my time in the last 2 months, and will increasingly so if we get a serious pandemic occurring in the autumn. So that's where it goes. The next thing that I spend my time in, and this is in my intro, is counter-terrorism. I won't, for obvious reasons, talk in a great deal of detail about that, but as Chief Scientific Advisor, I have a number of roles. I sit on the contest board, which deals with counter-terrorism, and is based in the Home Office. I chair one of the science subgroups of that, and we link with the security agencies, the security services, the Secret Intelligence Service, and the GCHQ, and also some of our national laboratories like the Atomic Weapons Establishment and Porton Down and so on. And the idea here is really that we are desperate to use science and technology to counter what is a very serious terrorist threat. And it's a terrorist threat that can go not just in terms of the sort of things we've observed of explosive devices used from unconventional materials, but also we obviously have real concerns that radiation, chemicals, and biological material will be used in future terrorist attacks, so we have to look at it. As I was saying, we are recruiting a chief scientist for MI5, and in fact I was interviewing one of the candidates this morning before I came over. So that's another area of responsibility that I and the Government Office of Science have. The responsibilities are across government. Now, but I also have the opportunity to meddle in other people's lives, and and one of the things that has worried me for some while has been scientific advice in Europe. Now, the way I've characterized this has been that compare what the Obama regime is doing and what is happening in Europe. And let me take you, Obama has really upped the stakes on science. The Bush administration, science was the sort of thing that you had in the back door, and it was a slightly disreputable relative who you didn't really want to see. When it was inconvenient, it was ignored. What Obama has said, and it's in the second quotation on there, that we have to listen to what our scientists say, even when it's inconvenient, in fact, especially when it's inconvenient, and put it at the top of our agenda. And he brought in a team, I'd call it, sort of slick US science dream team, but just to go through them, I've referred to Stephen Chu, pointing about the problems in California, Nobel Prize winner. Harold, if you go diagonally down from him to Harold Varmus, he's on the President's Advisory Council. He's also a Nobel Prize winner, and this time taken medicine. John Holdren is here in the UK at the moment, receiving a fellowship of the Royal Society, and Jane Lubchenco, on the bottom right, is a fellow of the Royal Society here, runs the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and Eric Lander is on the President's Advisory Council, and he was the one very, very centrally involved in the development of the Human Genome Project. That is an extraordinary set of people to be advising in the White House. We have some degree of comparability in the UK, but the strength of the Obama team and the Obama's commitment to science via the fiscal stimulus and increasingly taking notice of what science and engineering has to say is enormous. And to an extent, we're doing the same. Prime Minister, in his recent speech in Oxford, put the case that if we are going to solve the major problems, and it's in the second bullet point, these are the challenges that only science can answer. So that's good, we have support of the government. But compare and contrast that with Europe. This is the provision of science advice in between the USA, the UK, and the European Commission. USA, I've just gone through. 3 senior scientists advise the President, senior scientists in executive roles, Council of Advisors on Science. Within the UK, we've got 17 chief scientific advisors. We've got the CSA's group, got a chief scientific advisor, as Obama has, myself, and there's the Council for Science and Technology, which advises the Prime Minister directly. That has a Nobel Prize winner on it, Paul Nurse. It has Mark Wolpert, who directs the Wellcome Trust, and many other very senior engineers, scientists, and medics on it. that's just put a report into the Prime Minister on the importance of developing a 21st century infrastructure for the UK and where we've fallen behind. Look at the European Union. There is no chief scientific advisor in any of the other community countries except Ireland. There is no chief scientific advisor to the current President Barroso. In only one of the directorates of the European Commission is there a scientist in charge, and that's in the Joint Research Centre where Professor Roland Schenkel runs it. But the scientific advice that is actually coming into the European Commission is from a whole series of relatively low-level committees, essentially speak when spoken to committees. There is no independent challenge. There's no challenge at the policy level from science and engineering in the European Commission. Compare and contrast. This is something that I am really trying to move, because what I really believe is what the EU needs is a network of independent scientific advisors. We need to have this. I'm hoping to change by writing about it, by making this point, by going to Brussels and talking about it, to move that forward. Because I really believe this is one of the ways of security. I talked about the Arctic and the problems that the Arctic becoming ice-free is going to raise. Now, the Arctic has no sensible mechanism for dealing with the political, environmental, and resource challenges that occur. By contrast, the Antarctic is pretty good shape. The Antarctic has got, the Antarctic Treaty was signed by 47 countries. Its aim is to promote scientific research. It has various sort of spin-offs, one that deals with the living resources, and it's actually banned mineral exploitation completely. It works. There's been no conflicts in the Antarctic. One tiny exception would be when the Argentines invaded South Georgia, but apart from that, over the entire period, there's been no conflict. We're going to need something a bit like that in the Arctic, and so cooperation on science in the Arctic is going to be important, and we need to be thinking about extending that. So, interfering as I'm allowed to do, I believe that we need to be thinking about taking forward significant cooperation on Arctic science, and we've just signed an agreement with the Canadians for a memorandum of understanding to cooperate. Now, this is a big agenda, and it's a big agenda not just for myself and my team in the Government Office for Science, but it's an enormous agenda for the civil service in government. In the last slide or two, I'm just going to talk about the importance of science and engineering in the civil service. When I came to the job, I was head of profession, was the job description, head of profession in science and engineering. So I thought that was nice, you know, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but you know, you do that. And but it seemed to me that if I was head of profession, I should sort of find out who was here. So when I walked in the door, I said, well, can I have a data file of where the scientists and engineers are in each department in government, whether they're engineers, scientists, social scientists, and so on. And it didn't exist. Nobody knew. So we were left in this completely bizarre situation, and I'm head of profession. People vaguely think there may be 18,000 scientists and engineers in government, but they don't actually know. So what we did was we actually had a coming out party. Basically, we wrote around and advertised widely in departments and agencies and said, look, if you're prepared to admit to being a scientist and engineer, you can join this community, the government science and engineering community. One of my wittier members of staff suggested it should be called the Government Community of Scientists and Engineers, but I felt that GCSE was not an acronym that would be particularly conducive to support from either potential members or indeed being taken seriously outside it. So it's called Government Science and Engineering. We've had a first conference in January, and we've got 2,000 people have admitted to being scientists and engineers. Not because they're working in labs, but some of them are, or in working in field work, but in fact because they have science and engineering backgrounds, they work in policy or administration, but they use that science and engineering. 2,000 people are now members of that community. The aim is to double that over the next year. And we've had the first conference we had Sir Gus O'Donnell, Paul Drayson spoke at that conference. Whether in fact the location of the conference at the brewery in the East End of London had anything to do with of its popularity, I would not hesitate to speculate. But in fact, it worked pretty well. And we have at that conference, and 400 people attended out of the 2,000 who could. So we're having more conferences. There's one next week. And in a sense, the subjects of the conferences are determined by that group. We are wanting the community of scientists and engineers and government to work together to have things like information sharing, to actually say what are the problems. The conference that is next week I think is communicating uncertainty. Big problem, and we're wanting to do that. So those of you who are not signed up and are indeed scientists and engineers in government, sign up. There are wonderful presents and things to be had by being there, and we will be having conferences regularly during the year. There is a newsletter that we will be looking at to highlight job opportunities, training opportunities, and so on, because we need to get this community. The economists have got this community, the lawyers have got this community, even to an extent the operations researchers. Science and engineering hasn't had that, and it's mad that we have had to be self-selecting and that people are actually coming out and admitting to being a scientist and engineer, but it has enormous potential. So that's it, that's the in-tray, that's what it's like to be a government chief scientific advisor. It's quite a lot of fun. Given my reporting line, and my wife said to me when I first explained what the job was, she said, well, nobody's going to worry too much what you're doing on a Wednesday, because I'm sure the Prime Minister and Gus O'Donnell are rather too busy to care. And to an extent, that's actually true. I can follow my nose. I have the ability to challenge. I don't have to agree with government policy. I can challenge it. So it's a great job. So thanks for your time. I'm happy to answer a few questions if you've got any. Okay.